In the 1830s, the United States carried out a forced removal that uprooted entire nations and changed the course of American history. Welcome. Thank you for joining this story about the Trail of Tears, the forced march that reshaped lives, law, and the land itself. Stay with me, and you'll understand the choices that led to removal, what the journey actually looked like, and how its effects are still felt today. For generations, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole peoples lived across the Southeast. They farmed, built towns, traded, and governed their communities. By the early 1800s, many had adopted elements of European American life while keeping their own languages, beliefs, and laws. Their presence on the land was not uncertain, it was established and visible. Pressure came from settlers and state governments hungry for land. The discovery of gold in Georgia in 1829 and the expansion of cotton agriculture created fierce demand for Cherokee lands. State leaders and many white settlers argued that removal was necessary for progress. The federal government, meanwhile, was torn between a desire to expand and rising legal questions about the rights of indigenous nations. In 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act. It authorized the president to negotiate removal treaties, the legal cover for uprooting whole peoples. President Andrew Jackson strongly supported removal, arguing it would protect indigenous nations from extinction and prevent conflicts with states. Many historians disagree with that justification. In practice, the act set a course for displacement under the guise of law. Some leaders within indigenous nations sought to resist through courts, treaties, and diplomacy. The Cherokee Nation took their case to the U.S. Supreme Court. In 1831 and again in 1832, two landmark cases challenged state efforts to seize Cherokee land. The court recognized that indigenous nations were distinct political communities and that state laws had no force there. Legally, the Cherokees won a strong argument for sovereignty. But legal victory did not stop removal. President Jackson famously refused to enforce the court's decision, and Georgia continued to press its claims. A small, divided faction of Cherokee leaders, believing removal was inevitable or seeking personal advantage, signed the Treaty of New Echota in 1835. That treaty ceded Cherokee lands in exchange for land west of the Mississippi and promises of aid. The treaty was signed without the approval of the Cherokee National Council or Principal Chief John Ross, who led vocal opposition. When the U.S. government used that treaty as justification to begin removal in 1838, many Cherokee were not ready to leave. Army detachments rounded up families and placed them in internment camps. Some left under harsh pressure, others tried to hide or resist. The removals were organized as military marches, with troops supervising travel and regimented schedules. Routes differed, some walked overland, others were moved by steamboat part of the way. Weather, crowded conditions, and delays made the travel dangerous. The Choctaw had been the first to move under treaty in the early 1830s. They called their departure the Trail of Tears long before the word was applied broadly. The Cherokee removal in 1838 to 1839 is the most remembered, because of its scale and the legal drama around it. Estimates suggest that of the roughly 16,000 Cherokee who were removed from their homelands, about 40 died along the journey or soon after. Causes included disease, exposure, and lack of adequate food and shelter. Similar suffering affected the Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and other nations forced to move. It is important to be clear and respectful when we speak of that suffering. Many people, elders, children, and leaders endured illness, heartbreak, and the loss of homes and sacred places. Describing those losses in measured, factual terms honors the memory of those who endured them and recognizes the human cost without reducing it to spectacle. Why did removal happen despite legal rulings and protests? Several forces combined: relentless settler expansion, state governments asserting new authority over indigenous lands, federal leaders prioritizing growth and political compromise, and internal divisions within indigenous nations created under extreme pressure. The Treaty of New Echota itself illustrates how contested authority became a pretext for broader policy. The federal government chose to accept an agreement signed by a minority and use it to justify mass displacement. The march itself had a rhythm of ordinary life turned upside down. Families gathered what they could carry. Beloved places were left behind. Along the routes, camps were set up for rest. Sometimes local communities tried to help, sometimes strife, weather, and lack of supplies made survival uncertain. The removals broke up established communities and traditions, but they did not erase them. Many survivors rebuilt their nations in new places, maintaining language, law, and culture. The legal and political aftermath mattered deeply. The failure to enforce the Supreme Court's decision showed a limit to judicial authority when the executive branch and states refused cooperation. The episode exposed tensions in the young republic over federal power, state power, and human rights. For Native nations, it highlighted both the vulnerability of legal protections and their own resilience in fighting for recognition and survival. The legacy of the Trail of Tears is complex. On one hand, it is a story of loss, land taken, lives ended, and communities disrupted. On the other hand, it is also a story of survival and renewal. Many Cherokee and other nations re-established governments, schools, churches, and economies in new homelands. They adapted while holding on to identity and memory. That resilience continues to shape their communities today. In the long view, removal affected the nation too. It opened large tracts of land for settlement and economic growth, but it left a moral and political wound. Debates about sovereignty, treaty obligations, and the meaning of justice in American law trace back to this moment. In more recent years, historians, Indigenous leaders, and communities have worked to memorialize the Trail of Tears and to teach its lessons. There are monuments, preserved routes, and educational programs that aim to keep memory alive and to foster understanding. When we remember the Trail of Tears now, we are called to do more than recount facts. We are called to listen to the voices of descendants, to learn from the legal and moral failures of the past, and to support the ongoing rights of Indigenous peoples. Memory can lead to recognition, and recognition can be the first step toward meaningful change. If you want to explore more stories like this, please consider subscribing. Your attention helps keep these histories visible. In the final frame, imagine a small child looking back across a river at a home they will not see again. Imagine elders teaching language and songs to the next generation in a new place. These are images of loss, yes, but also of continuity. The Trail of Tears was a forced march that reshaped a nation, but it did not erase the peoples who walked it. Their stories remain, and they matter. Thank you for listening. Hook plus greeting, a forced march begins. When the federal government insisted that Native nations move west of the Mississippi, whole communities faced a choice no people should ever be forced to make. Hello. Leaders weighed the law, treaties, and the safety of women, children, and elders against a tide of settlers and the power of the United States military. The Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, also called the Muskogee, and Seminole each responded in different ways, but the result was the same. Large numbers of people were pushed from lands they had occupied for generations and sent on long, painful journeys. Leaders used every avenue they had. The Cherokee turned to the courts and won a measure of justice. The United States Supreme Court recognized Cherokee rights to their lands in a clear decision. Yet, the ruling had little power without enforcement from the executive branch. Other nations tried treaties, some negotiated by full councils, others signed by small factions under pressure. The Treaty of New Echota, signed by a minority of Cherokee leaders, is a clear example. It ceded land and set the terms for removal while most Cherokee leaders and people opposed it. Conflicting decisions made by governments, councils, and individuals deepened fractures inside communities. Trust eroded. Tensions rose. The removal itself began with roundups and orders to move to designated sites. Military units and federal agents established gathering places, sometimes called removal camps or stockades. People arrived carrying what they could, a few household items, some tools, family heirlooms, and stories of place. Many families had to sell or abandon homes, fields, and community buildings. Travel plans varied. Some groups were taken by steamboat along rivers when available and when money permitted. Many more went by foot or wagon, following rough roads and trails made worse by rain and mud. The journeys were not planned as comfortable trips. Supplies were uneven, and the logistics of moving entire nations were poorly managed. Cold mornings and long stretches of walking are often remembered first. Then come the illnesses that spread quickly in close quarters, and the food shortages as supply lines faltered. Still, there were acts of care and courage along the way. Men, women, and elders tended those who were weak. People shared what little they had. Leaders like Chief John Ross of the Cherokee tried tirelessly to protect their people, to use negotiation and the law, and later to organize removal with as much safety as possible. Others, such as members of the treaty party like Major Ridge, believed removal was inevitable and hoped negotiation would preserve some future for their families. The choices were heartbreaking and complex. The routes themselves became part of the history. Trails crossed rivers and mountains, cut through plains, and ran along the edges of new settlements. Some groups paused at forts and military posts. Others made hurried departures to avoid confrontation. Camps sprung up along the way where entire families rested, repaired footwear, tended small graves, and planned the next day. Loss came slowly for many. It arrived in the form of sickness, exposure, lack of food, and the exhaustion that comes from continuous travel. Human names were recorded in lists, petitions were written, and letters tried to reach distant relatives. Those records remain. They are not just dry documents. They tell of neighbors helping neighbors, of children carrying small bundles, of musicians trying to keep spirits high, and of the stubborn insistence, even then, on memory and ceremony. This was not the end of life for the nations who marched. It was an attempt to erase place and displace identity, but it also became a story of survival. Once in the lands set aside for them, communities rebuilt churches, schools, and councils. They planted new fields and established new towns. Cultural practices continued in new landscapes, carried by people determined to preserve language, law, and history. At the same time, the loss of homelands changed family life and community structures forever. Memory deepened into trauma, passed down across generations. That legacy can be seen in legal debates, in the continued pursuit of recognition and rights, and in the efforts to protect sacred sites and records. Public memory evolved slowly. Monuments, trails, and educational efforts now attempt to tell the fuller story. Laws and policies since then have changed in response to the moral and legal questions raised by those removals, and many people today work to ensure the truth of what happened is not forgotten. Descendants keep alive songs, stories, and governance structures that link back to those homelands. Museums and tribal archives hold the names and artifacts that survived. Schools, historians, and community groups use those sources to teach new generations about responsibility, resilience, and the costs of forced migration. The mathematics of loss is hard to state without cold numbers. Instead, think of the quieter facts: families separated, homeland ties severed, language and ceremony carried like a hidden ember. The law recognized rights at times and then failed to protect them. Decisions made in distant offices and local councils met in the middle of the lives of ordinary people. Every route became a test of endurance and every stop a place where memory took root. People survived. They also mourned. Both remain true. This story still reaches forward today. Courts and governments refer back to the legal chapters written during that era. Tribal governments continue to assert sovereignty and to seek remedies for past wrongs. Community rituals recall those who were lost and those who led. Efforts to preserve and teach the true history grow stronger with each generation. The legacy is therefore both a warning and a charge: to remember, to listen, and to ensure that forced removal is not glibly repeated. Thank you for listening with care. If you would like more stories that honor these histories and the people who lived them, please subscribe for respectful, fact-based narratives. Background: land pressure, treaties, and the Indian Removal Act. When settlers pushed west in search of land for crops and new homes, pressure on indigenous nations in the southeast grew intense and constant. Hello. The economic appetite for cotton and other staples drove planters and speculators to seek fresh territory, and state governments answered with laws and claims that reduced the space where Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole communities lived, farmed, and governed themselves. Indigenous nations had adopted many European farming techniques and built towns and schools. They were not simply living on the land for hunting. Yet the growing settler population, backed by state power and federal policy, treated those lands as a prize to be acquired. Treaties became the common instrument for transferring indigenous land to the United States, but those agreements were often negotiated in conditions of coercion, unequal power, and urgent demand. Some treaties followed violence or military defeat, such as agreements that came after conflicts in which indigenous resistance was met with force. Others were concluded under intense political pressure when state officials, land speculators, and federal agents offered payments, annuities, or promises of other lands in exchange. The Treaty of Fort Jackson and the Treaty of Indian Springs are early examples that reduced Creek territory through terms many Creek leaders found unacceptable. The Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek, signed by Choctaw leaders, marked one of the first large-scale cessions in which a southeastern nation agreed, under pressure, to move westward. These agreements changed maps and lives, even when substantial portions of a nation's members opposed the cessions. The federal government then taken a decisive step when it passed a law giving the president authority to negotiate land exchanges and removal agreements with native nations. That law, the Indian Removal Act of 1830, established a formal policy of encouraging native nations to give up their ancestral lands in the East in return for territory west of the Mississippi. The act provided funding and a legal framework for negotiation. It did not use the word forcible removal, and some supporters argued it would be a voluntary and peaceful way to avoid conflict. Many leaders in Congress and in state capitals, however, saw removal as necessary to clear the way for settlement and economic development. The government agencies and local officials who put the law into practice often interpreted it in ways that disadvantaged indigenous communities and rushed negotiations that were unequal at every step. State actions deepened the pressure and eroded indigenous sovereignty. For example, the state of Georgia passed laws asserting control over Cherokee territory and overturned Cherokee laws, while state officials invalidated Cherokee courts and attempted to impose their own jurisdiction. The discovery of gold in parts of Cherokee lands intensified settler demand and pushed officials to act quickly. Courts became a battleground. The United States Supreme Court recognized aspects of tribal sovereignty in rulings such as Worcester v. Georgia, which held that states could not unilaterally impose their laws on Indian nations within their own territories. That decision affirmed legal protections, but enforcement depended on the executive branch, which was often unwilling to back the court. The result was a paradox: national law recognized indigenous rights, but political power at other levels worked to dismantle those rights in practice. Negotiated treaties under this new posture were frequently flawed. Some were signed by small groups claiming to represent their nations but lacking broad consensus. The Treaty of New Echota, for instance, was signed by a minority faction of Cherokee leaders who favored removal. The principal chief and a large majority of the Cherokee Nation opposed it. Yet the Senate ratified the treaty and the federal government used it as legal authority to proceed. Across the Southeast, promises of fair compensation, safe transit, and new lands were made. In countless cases, those promises were only partly fulfilled, delayed, or administered in ways that favored local interests over indigenous welfare. Payments arrived late or were mismanaged. Provisions for supplies and protection often failed. This pattern, ceding land in exchange for distant territory, payments, and promises, served the immediate interests of settlers and states while creating deep uncertainty and loss for indigenous communities. Political and economic motives were tightly bound. Supporters of removal argued that separation would prevent ongoing conflict and allow the United States to grow without internal friction. Critics warned that uprooting entire nations was unjust and dangerous. Many Northern missionaries, some members of Congress, and Native leaders themselves protested removals on moral, legal, and practical grounds. But the economic logic of the cotton economy, the power of state governments such as Georgia, and the voting constituencies that benefited from expansion shaped policy choices that favored removal. The federal government's endorsement of land exchanges and relocation altered the balance between law and power. Local enforcement and the willingness of state officials to push aside indigenous authority made negotiation a one-sided process more often than not. The background of land pressure, treaty-making, and the Indian Removal Act set the stage for the removals that followed. Laws and treaties provided a legal story to justify moving nations, while economic demand and state-level aggression created the forceful reality. Some leaders hoped that negotiated removal might preserve life and sovereignty in altered form. Others resisted until they were overwhelmed by political and military power. What followed involved long movements, broken promises, and the reordering of the Southeast's human geography. The legacies of those decisions still shape law and memory. Treaties that were made under duress are today the subject of historical study and legal scrutiny. Nations that survived removal continue to govern, to maintain culture, and to seek recognition and justice for past wrongs. This is a story about how economics, law, and politics combined to change the map of a nation and the lives of many people. Thank you for listening. If you would like more stories that examine American history with care and respect, please subscribe. The Cherokee and Legal Fight, Court Rulings and Political Reality. When the Cherokee turned to the United States courts, they did so with treaties in hand and a clear claim: their land and their laws should be respected. Hello. They presented a careful legal case that asked the nation's highest judges to recognize what Cherokee leaders had always said, that they were a distinct people with the right to govern themselves and to live under the protection of the federal government. Their path brought them into two landmark Supreme Court cases. In one, Cherokee leaders asked the court to hear them as a nation bringing a complaint against a state. The court did not decide the Cherokee to be a foreign nation in the constitutional sense. Instead, Chief Justice John Marshall used a new phrase. He described the tribes as domestic dependent nations, a formulation that acknowledged a special, trustee-like relationship between the federal government and indigenous nations. That language established an important legal status, even while the court said it could not grant the particular relief the Cherokee requested in that case. A second case went further. It grew from the arrest of missionaries and Cherokee citizens who refused to obey Georgia laws that tried to control what happened inside Cherokee territory. The Supreme Court held that the laws of Georgia had no force where the Cherokee Nation's own authority prevailed. Justice Marshall wrote that only the federal government, not a state, could deal with Indian nations. The ruling made clear that states could not simply expand their authority into the lands and governance of an indigenous people under treaty protections. The legal reasoning was strong and carefully argued. Attorneys like William Wirt and Native leaders such as John Ross brought petitions, briefs, and oral arguments that cited treaties, constitutional principles, and long practice. Samuel Worcester's case exemplified the larger fight. He had lived and worked within Cherokee lands and resisted Georgia's licensing law. His conviction was what produced the court's clear statement that states could not enforce their own laws on Cherokee territory. The court's words favored federal responsibility and Cherokee rights in a way that should have had direct force. But law did not act alone. Political power moved in a different direction. The presidential administration at the time declined to use federal power to enforce the court's decision against Georgia. Federal marshals did not step into Georgia to reverse convictions or halt the state's plans. State officials continued to press for removal and land settlement. A treaty written and signed by a small minority of Cherokee leaders, not the National Council, was sent to the federal government and eventually ratified. That agreement provided a political cover that allowed removals to begin, even though it did not represent the will of most Cherokee people. The contrast between courtroom victory and political reality was stark. The Cherokee had won recognition in principle, yet the machinery of enforcement stayed idle. Leaders like John Ross traveled to the Capitol, spoke with lawmakers, reported the court's opinion, and filed petitions with Congress. They sought help in the halls of power. Many white citizens and missionaries supported them openly. They hoped law and public opinion would force a different outcome. Still, the federal government chose a path that respected the treaty process only in form, while enabling the state to proceed. The journey that followed was shaped by both these legal judgments and the political choices that ignored them. Cherokee arguments before the court remain a record of legal talent and unyielding insistence on treaty rights. The missionary cases and the court's language about sovereignty would become part of American legal doctrine. Yet the immediate result showed how fragile legal protections can be when political leaders refuse to act. Decisions on paper mean little without the will to implement them. In the years that followed, the image of the Cherokee legal struggle became a touchstone in the history of federal Indian law. The phrase domestic dependent nation entered the lexicon of courts and scholars, framing later debates over sovereignty, tribal jurisdiction, and the limits of state power. Worcester v. Georgia has been cited in cases where courts were asked to decide whether state laws can reach into Indian country. Lawyers today still point to those opinions when they argue about tribal self-government, criminal jurisdiction, and regulatory authority on reservation lands. At the same time, the political lessons remain sobering. The Cherokee experience shows that legal victories need political backing to become real protections. It also shows how minority decisions, irregular treaties, and the choices of federal officials can determine outcomes for entire peoples. The tribe's careful use of petitions, legal briefs, and diplomatic appeals did much to shape public understanding and later legal protections. But those tools did not stop the forced removals or the suffering that followed. The legacy is mixed. On the legal plane, the Cherokee fight helped build doctrines that protect tribal sovereignty from state encroachment. On the human plane, it stands as a record of courage and of loss. Today, Cherokee governments and other tribal nations continue to draw on those early court decisions when defending their rights. Contemporary courts reference Marshall's reasoning when they consider the balance of federal, state, and tribal power. The law that grew from this period still matters in land disputes, in criminal cases, and in disputes over environmental regulation and taxation. The story also teaches about persistence and the limits of legal argument when separated from political will. Native leaders did everything available to them. They negotiated, they litigated, they appealed to public sympathy, and they secured eloquent support from allies in the North. Their legal record stands as a careful, principled, and ultimately influential achievement. The failure to secure protection at the time, however, is a reminder that constitutional principles do not automatically translate into humane policy. In calm conclusion, the Cherokee legal fight reshaped American legal thinking even as it revealed the hard truths of political power. The courts offered a framework for recognizing tribal sovereignty and limiting state power. Federal inaction and the choices of other actors turned that framework into a lesson rather than a shield. The memory of those legal battles helps explain why tribal sovereignty remains a live and contested issue today, and why legal victories must often be matched by political advocacy and public support. Thank you for listening. If you found this account meaningful, please subscribe for more stories that look closely at law, leadership, and the lives at their center. The removal, roundups, camps, and the start of the journey. Hello. During the 19th century, the United States government moved from negotiation to force as its official policy toward many indigenous nations, and that choice set in motion a chain of roundups, camps, and marches that would upend lives and landscapes. News traveled fast along small trails and through council houses. Leaders argued in public and in private. Some leaders sought legal remedies and appeals to national institutions. Others made a different choice under heavy pressure, signing treaties that they believed would save some people by giving up land. A disputed treaty, signed by a small group who did not speak for the majority, became the legal basis for forcible removal. Opposition was strong among community leaders and families who had built schools, farms, and churches. They protested, and they petitioned. Yet orders still came down from state governments and from federal commanders. The law and the sword were joined. Soldiers and local militias began to gather. Troops rode into valleys and towns. They established barracks and guarded public squares. Families were told to bring a limited amount of personal goods and to report to designated collection points. Some people complied out of fear or exhaustion. Others resisted by staying hidden in the hills or attempting to move west on their own. In many places, men from the surrounding counties were hired as guards or helpers, and contractors promised to provide wagons, food, and guidance. Those promises often broke down under the stress of numbers and distance. Roundups were organized with military precision. Regiments surrounded settlements at dawn. People were assembled in groups and counted. Women and children were held with older men in pens in temporary enclosures. Men who spoke for their nations pleaded for clemency or delay. The army largely ignored those pleas. Not every place looked the same. In some towns, people were marched to nearby stockades and kept under guard. In others, they were ordered onto ferries or local steamboats where they waited on riverbanks behind lines of sentries. The sense of being in transit before a longer movement changed how people packed and who they trusted. Camps were set up as holding places while the logistics of a mass movement were arranged. One well-documented depot became a grim hub. Long rows of tents and log structures stretched across a flat valley, and the constant sound of business, horses, wagons, and shouted orders filled the air. People from scattered farms and distant towns were now close neighbors, sharing stories and scarce supplies. Health officers tried to care for the sick. But crowding, exposure to unfamiliar weather, and limited medical knowledge created an environment where illness could spread. Food distribution was irregular. Blankets and shelter were not always adequate. A few able-bodied men did their best to organize work details, to mend a wagon, to teach children, or to keep spirits from sinking completely. Still, the strain was visible in faces and in the quiet of nights. Leaders of the affected nations tried to manage the chaos. The principal chief of one group sought to negotiate time to move people in better order and to secure better provisions. He traveled, wrote letters, and met commanders. Others who had signed the treaty expecting voluntary resettlement found themselves in the painful position of seeing relatives rounded up and forced to leave. A few families were granted short reprieves because of illness, unfinished harvests, or a commanding officer's whim. These delays could mean life or death for some. They also meant uncertainty for everyone. When the march finally began, it did so in detachments. Some columns left by river, piled into barges and steamboats, heading downriver until the craft could no longer proceed and men, women, and children had to march the rest of the way. Others set out overland. Large groups moved with wagons that carried the elderly, the very young, and the weak. Soldiers rode with orders to keep the columns moving, to prevent escapes, and to maintain a timetable created by officials who wanted the land cleared on a set schedule. Guides led them across ridges, over swollen streams, and through stretches where food was thin. The pace varied. At times it was steady and slow, at others it became hurried when supplies ran low or when winter weather approached. Small, human scenes threaded through every mile. A mother taught her child a lullaby as they walked beside a cart. An elder recited names of ancestral places to keep memory alive. A young man who had never traveled far learned to tend a team of oxen. Across these acts, there was courage and sorrow. Friends quietly arranged to bury a loved one near a grove. Women stitched little markers to hold a keepsake. These private details mattered. They gave shape to the experience and linked what was happening to what had always been. The management of the movement revealed deeper problems. Contracts for food, wagons, and medical supplies were expensive and often handled by private companies with little oversight. Corruption and delay were frequent complaints. Military commanders sometimes intervened to requisition supplies, and local settlers who wanted the land watched the camps with impatience and, in many cases, satisfaction. Meanwhile, those in charge of the removals made decisions that prioritized speed and territorial control over humane treatment. The result was that many who began the journey were weakened by the time they left the camps. Stories of individuals surfaced in letters and petitions that later reached newspapers and sympathetic officials. A chief's speech pleading for his people's right to remain was published and read aloud in distant towns. Families kept journals and wrote notes that they managed to hide or pass along during the movement. Some outsiders, missionaries, traders, and a few journalists tried to document conditions, and their reports show a mixture of sympathy and the limited power to change events. The start of the journey created a pattern that would be remembered for generations. Places where the detained had waited became part of a collective memory, valleys where mothers packed baskets, river landings where boats took on human cargo, and long stretches of road where the first detachments marched away under watchful eyes. Commemoration grew slowly, through stories told at kitchen tables and council meetings, through songs sung in new places, and through the names people continued to call the places they'd left behind. Finally, the legacy of these roundups and camps can be felt in the lives that followed. Families who survived carried with them sorrow, resilience, and cultural practices that they preserved in new lands. Leadership structures changed. Legal battles and cries for justice continued for years. The decisions that authorized forced removal altered the political landscape of a growing nation, reshaping who controlled what land and how populations moved within it. For descendants, the camps and the first steps of the march are not merely historical facts. They are living memories, taught to children, honored in ceremonies, and recorded in museums and archives. Thank you for listening to this account. If you would like more stories that explore difficult history with care and respect, please subscribe for future narratives that remember and reckon with the past. The Trail, Winter, Hunger, Loss, Non-Graphic, Survival. The United States government ordered the removal of the Cherokee and several other indigenous nations from their homelands, sending thousands on long marches into unfamiliar territory. Hello, this is a story about winter, hunger, loss, and the stubborn will to survive during that forced journey. It began with decisions made far from the small farms and towns of the southeastern woodlands, and it unfolded on roads that were little more than trails through cold and mud. Officials at state and national levels pushed removal as policy, and treaties, often signed under pressure or through fraud, gave legal cover to an act that many leaders within the nations rejected. Cherokee leaders pursued every legal and peaceful option available, taking cases to courts and petitioning officials. Yet choices by governors and military commanders turned negotiation into march orders. Men with rifles and soldiers with orders oversaw ferries, wagons, and foot columns. Supplies were promised and often failed to arrive in adequate amounts. That failure mattered. It shaped the day-to-day reality of families who had to leave behind houses, crops, and cemeteries. Winter found many groups on the road. Cold weather meant wet clothing that could not dry, frozen ground that made digging campsites harder, and nights when firewood burned quickly. Food stores ran low, and official supply lines sputtered. Corn, flour, and salt were rationed in small quantities. People shared what little they had. Mothers wrapped children tightly in blankets. Elders were helped along by younger relatives. There were brief, bright moments, a warming fire, a pot of soup boiled and stretched across a dozen mouths, the comfort of a familiar song told low around embers. Yet hunger was a constant companion. Stomachs growled. People learned to stretch a handful of cornmeal farther than they believed possible. Loss came in many forms. The loss of life was felt in every camp circle, though descriptions remain careful and respectful here. People died from cold, from weakening illness, and from the invisible bite of exhaustion. Death separated families. Some graves were dug hurriedly at the road's edge, small mounds breaking the winter landscape. But there were other, quieter losses, the ending of ways of life tied to particular land, the loss of gardens and orchards that had fed generations, the loss of legal standing and of treaties that had once promised protection. Children who had been born into a settled life now grew up walking. Stories were suddenly untethered from place. The elders who had held those stories were sometimes gone, and with them went details of place-based knowledge, where the best fishing holes were, which plants help soothe fever, how to read signs in the snow. Survival demanded inventiveness and deep community bonds. People pooled food and supplies. When rations failed, foraging became essential. Travelers gathered roots and whatever greens could be found under frost-hardened leaves. Those who could fish or trap did so to bring fresh meat to the camp. Simple tools were repurposed to mend clothing and make sleds. Wagons were shared and loaded unevenly, with the heaviest possessions, quilts, a pot, a Bible, a medicinal herb box, saved for those who could still carry them. Leaders within each community organized small detachments, deciding which route to take, when to rest, and who needed extra help. Women and elders became deft at creating warmth with quilts and using dried herbs to soothe fevers. Children, even when tired and thin, were kept close. There were also acts of care that did not make headlines but mattered just the same. A neighbor giving the last spoonful of thickened soup. Young men walking beside an older woman, steadying her step. A teacher who shared her bundle of seeds, saying those plants would help rebuild a garden someday. Missionaries and some local citizens did bring assistance at points along the march. Those gifts sometimes saved lives, though they could not undo the larger force that had set the removal in motion. Some detachments found river passages and used boats for part of their route, which eased the strain for a time. Others remained on foot for much of the journey, moving slowly as temperatures dipped and muddy trails sank with thaw. Practical knowledge was central to survival. People repaired shoes with leather scraps, boiled narrow rations of gruel and flavored it with wild roots, and taught children songs that doubled as counting or calming devices. Sleep was improvised on beds of straw and quilts. Fires were tended carefully, both for warmth and to conserve scarce wood. When someone became too weak to walk, plans were made collectively, extra hands carried pots and blankets, a cart was rearranged, a family swapped parcels so the weakest could be placed under duvets. These decisions were small and crucial acts of political will, choices that said, in effect, we will carry one another. The emotional landscape of the trail deepened the sense of loss, but also fortified survival. People held private ceremonies to honor what they had left behind. They sang old songs in the evenings and told stories of home so that children would remember streams and hills by name. The repetition of those memories was a kind of resistance. It kept the lineage of culture intact. And even amid sorrow, there were moments of tenderness, hands clasped across shared blankets, whispered prayers, the soft laughter that springs up among those who refuse to be defined only by grief. Legacy followed the march. The winter hunger and the many losses became part of a nation's conscience, a painful chapter that shaped relationships between indigenous nations and the government for generations. Institutions failed to protect many commitments. But the legacy is not only pain. Survival produced a living continuity. Communities rebuilt in new places, planted new crops, re-established schools, and maintained languages and legal traditions. Descendants today speak of ancestors who survived that winter march and credit those forebears with the strength to preserve language, ceremony, and political institutions. Memory works like a hand on a shoulder, it steadies. There are lessons in those cold miles. One is the concrete cost of policy enacted without consent. When decisions are made in Capitol rooms and carried out by force, the human consequences spill into every camp on the road. Another is the unbreakable importance of community care. Shared bread and shared blankets did more than stave off hunger, they preserved the social ties that made rebuilding possible. The story of survival is not a triumphant story free from loss. It is a sober story about endurance, and about how people carried a culture and a future across a landscape that tried to take both. Listen for the small signs of resilience, a song hummed by the fireside, an elder teaching a child to twist a coil of rope, a woman pressing a thumb into the soil to see if a seed will take. Those acts kept things alive. They are the reason families rebuilt homes and retaught the next generation how to plant and how to pray. The march left scars on land and on hearts, but it did not end identity or the capacity to care for one another. Thank you for listening to this account. If you found this story meaningful, please consider subscribing for more historical narratives told with respect and care. Aftermath, arrival, rebuilding, and why it still matters. Hello. The people who reached the western lands after forced removal arrived into a landscape that was unfamiliar but not empty. It was already home to many tribes and full of challenges. Leaders who had once argued in court and at treaty tables now had to make immediate choices about shelter, food, and safety. Some decisions were practical and urgent. Others shaped politics for generations. Arrival meant loss beyond what could be counted in baggage. Families stepped off wagons and left graves, fields, and towns behind. They found winter shelters inadequate, seed stores missing, and water sources different from those they knew. Illness and exhaustion followed many groups. Camps sprang up near rivers and creeks. Temporary houses were built from logs and canvas. Relief sometimes came from unexpected places. Neighboring indigenous communities shared food and medicine when they could. Relief was not enough, and suffering altered everyday life in deep ways. Rebuilding began with small actions that slowly gathered force. People planted what they could, raised livestock, and rebuilt fences and barns. Tribal councils reconvened and rewrote laws to fit a new reality. The Cherokee, for example, re-established a court system and continued to use a written language to record laws in newspapers. Teaching and literacy were priorities. Schools reopened or started anew, often blending older cultural teachings with new needs. Churches and meeting houses became places for both spiritual practice and civic planning. Elders taught children stories and songs that held land memory in a new place. Those memories kept identity alive even as geography had changed. Leaders wrestled with legal and political questions at the same time they rebuilt homes. Earlier court victories that recognized tribal sovereignty had come and gone in their consequences. Treaties that were supposed to protect land had been broken or renegotiated under pressure. Some leaders chose litigation and diplomacy, hoping the courts or the federal government would restore rights. Others focused on immediate survival and local governance. This mix of responses shows the hard choices leaders faced: fight in the courts, take what resources were available, or try to do both at once. Communities adapted economic life too. Farmers learned new soil and weather patterns, and they adjusted crops and techniques. Craftspeople and traders formed new markets. Newspapers and printed material resumed in Cherokee and English, helping to spread news and to organize schooling and legal affairs. New towns appeared, built with a design that reflected both traditional patterns and the influence of American settler town planning. These were not simple replications of what had been lost. They were creative responses shaped by grief and hope. Cultural rebuilding was quieter but no less important. Ceremonies were moved to different hills and rivers. Language kept its hold through family and classroom. Songs about home and origin were sung in new places. Children learned to weave and make tools as their parents had taught them. Many people kept names for places they could no longer see, speaking them aloud to keep memory alive. At the same time, people adapted some practices to the new environment, changing hunting routes and seasonal rounds. This blending of continuity and change allowed communities to remain cohesive. The emotional and social aftermath passed down through generations. Displacement severed direct ties to ancestral burial grounds and sacred sites. That loss is not only personal, it changed how communities anchored their histories. Descendants have lived with questions about identity, land, and belonging ever since. At the same time, the institutions rebuilt in the new territory, tribal courts, schools, councils, became the scaffolding for modern tribal sovereignty. Those institutions are strong today because they were forged under pressure and rebuilt with care. Why this still matters is straightforward and deep. The forced removals set precedents about federal power, state pressure, and tribal sovereignty that echo in courts and policy debates now. For instance, decisions made by tribal leaders to pursue legal recognition and to maintain governance structures enabled later generations to argue for jurisdictional and treaty rights. Today's legal framework for tribal sovereignty rests partly on the resilience shown during and after removal. Decisions made in those desperate years shaped the outline of government-to-government relations that persist. Public memory and education have also changed because of the aftermath. Trails, markers, and museums now exist to teach about the routes and the people who walked them. Tribal nations lead many of these educational efforts, telling the stories with language, music, and objects that belong to them. When students and visitors learn the facts, not only of the march but of how communities rebuilt, it reframes the national story. This matters for civic life, because it brings fuller understanding of how the United States expanded and at what cost. Modern problems of health, housing, and economics in many tribal communities can be traced back in part to displacement. Loss of productive land, interruption of kin networks, and the trauma of removal affected generations. Those are not abstract consequences. They show up in school outcomes, access to healthcare, and political representation. Recognizing this link helps shape policy. It also clarifies why tribal nations press for autonomy, fair treaty interpretation, and resources to rebuild what was taken. Memorials and rituals keep the memory active. Annual commemorations, storytelling gatherings, and the work of tribal historians turn personal memory into public history. These practices challenge simplified narratives and insist that history include the voices of those who lived it. They also provide a path toward healing, because remembrance is a social act that honors loss and names responsibility. There are practical lessons too. The way communities organized food relief, shared medicine, and rebuilt schools offers models for crisis response that center local knowledge. Policymakers and relief organizations can learn from this history by listening to tribal leaders and honoring local authority in times of displacement. That approach is relevant today, when climate change and other displacements make questions of resettlement and sovereignty more urgent. Rebuilding was not a single story of recovery. It was many parallel stories of people who refused to let their cultures be erased. That refusal took legal forms, economic forms, and cultural forms. It took the everyday work of teaching children the language and the crafts, of recording laws, and of tending small plots of land until they produced crops. These acts built a bridge from loss to continuity. As a nation, remembering the aftermath responsibly means acknowledging both the failure of policy and the strength of those who moved forward. It also means supporting tribal-led initiatives to protect sacred sites, teach history accurately, and strengthen health and education systems within tribal nations. Supporting these efforts is a practical way to honor what was lost and to invest in what remains. Thank you for listening to this story of arrival, rebuilding, and why it continues to matter. If you want more stories told with care and facts, please subscribe and share. There is more to learn, and these voices deserve to be heard. Imagine being told you must leave the land your family tended for generations. Hello, thank you for staying with me through this story. We have traced how pressure for land, expanding laws, and political choices combine to make removal law in practice. We looked at the 1830 Indian Removal Act, the broken treaties and disputed signatures like the Treaty of New Dakota, the U.S. government's failure to uphold legal protections, and the long, forced marches led by federal troops. We heard about the daily realities of the journey: cold, illness, lack of supplies, and the loss of too many lives. We also met survivors whose resilience preserved language, law, and community in the face of displacement. To sum up the key points, a federal policy driven by expansion and state interests overrode the sovereignty of indigenous nations, court decisions and legal protections were not enforced, removal was carried out under harsh conditions and caused great suffering, and yet, indigenous peoples endured and kept their cultures alive. Those simple facts changed the nation legally, morally, and geographically. First, know these are difficult truths. Remembering them is not meant to dwell in pain but to acknowledge what happened, to honor those who suffered, and to learn why history matters now. When we recognize the consequences of choices made long ago, we can better understand present injustices and the ongoing work for rights, recognition, and healing. The legacy is complex. The Trail of Tears forced a reshaping of the American map and left wounds that persisted across generations. It also sparked resistance, legal claims, and the persistence of culture and community. Today, memorials, museums, and the voices of indigenous leaders ask us to listen, to support sovereignty, and to learn from the past rather than repeat it. If this history moved you, take a moment to reflect, to read more from indigenous sources, and to share what you've learned with others. If you want more context, we'll be exploring related stories in upcoming videos: the legal battles that followed, the stories of other nations affected by removal, and the living traditions that endured. If you'd like to continue this journey with us, please subscribe. Your attention matters. Thank you for watching and for choosing to remember. We'll be back with more history that helps explain who we are today and how we might do better tomorrow.